Cinema makes us watch someone's destruction for 2 hours, and we buy it. Curiously, the scenes we remember most are usually the ones where characters suffer the most. Maybe that's a sign suffering is trying to tell us something. So through 7 films, let's explore the different meanings it carries on screen. The Tree of Life, 2011. Terrence Malick's film follows the O'Brien family in 1950s Texas, centered on the death of one of 3 sons and the grief that follows decades later, when the eldest, Jack, revisits his childhood as an adult. The film opens with a line from the Book of Job. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" It's a question with no answer, and Malick builds the entire film around that absence. Kierkegaard drew a sharp line between resignation and faith. Resignation gives up what it loves and finds peace in the giving up. It asks for nothing back. Faith does something stranger. It gives up the same thing, and then expects to receive it again, not through logic, but through what Kierkegaard called virtue of the absurd. Most people, he argued, never get past resignation. They mistake surrender for faith, because faith looks identical from the outside. The difference is invisible, internal, almost impossible to prove. Jack's mother performs this distinction without naming it. She tells her children there are 2 ways through life: nature, which fights and keeps score, and grace, which absorbs injury without demanding an explanation. That's resignation's vocabulary. But grace, in Kierkegaard's stricter sense, requires more than absorbing loss. It requires still expecting the dead son back, against every rational signal that he's gone. The father never reaches even resignation. He treats suffering as an engineering failure, something that happens when control slips, and when his son still dies despite his control, he has no second framework to fall back on. The film's closing sequence, the beach, the family reassembled, the dead brother walking toward them, stages exactly what Kierkegaard described as faith's absurd reward. Not consolation, but the finite thing itself, restored on terms reason never authorized.
Firemen said they pulled Randy out. She passed out downstairs. And then the furnace blew, and they couldn't go back in again. And that's all I remember.
Manchester by the Sea, 2016. Kenneth Lonergan's film follows Lee Chandler, a janitor in Boston who returns to his hometown after his brother's death and becomes guardian to his teenage nephew. Flashbacks slowly reveal why Lee left in the first place. A house fire, caused by his own negligence, killed his 3 children. His marriage ended. He never forgave himself, and the film never asks the audience to either. Camus argued that the universe doesn't owe human beings an explanation, and the demand for one, the insistence that suffering must add up to something, is itself the trap. He called this the absurd, not chaos, but the gap between our hunger for meaning and a world that stays silent about it. Most people respond to that silence by inventing a story that closes the gap. Lee doesn't. When his ex-wife Randy, remarried and pregnant, tries to reconcile with him on the street, she offers him exactly what Camus would call a false exit: forgiveness, closure, a narrative arc. Lee can't take it. He starts a sentence, can't finish it, and walks away, choosing the discomfort of an unfinished thought over the relief of a tidy one. By the end, Lee remains bound by grief. He tells his nephew outright that he can't beat it, but he builds a small accommodation alongside it anyway: a part-time room in his life, a door left open. For Camus, that's the only kind of victory available. Not transcendence, not meaning, just the refusal to stop carrying the weight.
God made me, didn't he? So he understands me. He must do. Don't you think?
I think if God can't understand you, Freddie, no one can.
Calvary, 2014. John Michael McDonough's film opens with a confession booth. A man tells Father James he was raped repeatedly as a child by a priest, and because that priest is dead, he's decided to kill a good priest instead, 1 week from now, on the beach. James spends the film's remaining days going about his pastoral duties in a small Irish town, fully aware of the date closing in, refusing to name his attacker or run. Dostoevsky's own answer to the problem of innocent suffering wasn't an argument, it was a practice. Through the monk Zosima, he proposed that guilt isn't a fixed quantity assigned to whoever committed the act. Every person carries responsibility on behalf of everyone else, whether they caused the harm or not, and he meant this as a literal account of how moral responsibility works, not as a comforting figure of speech. Refusing to answer for a stranger's sin, in this view, treats other people's suffering as none of your business. James embodies that claim almost too literally. He never committed the abuse he's being killed for, but he also never tries to argue his way out of the debt. He doesn't say that wasn't me, doesn't produce an alibi for his innocence. He treats the killer's logic as a debt the church owes regardless of which priest collected it. That's the mechanism Zosima described. Suffering that isn't redistributed onto someone else, but voluntarily absorbed, stops manufacturing more of itself downstream. James walks to the beach carrying a debt he didn't incur, and the chain stops with him.
No, he's here. Christ is here. I just can't hear him.
Show God you love him. Save the lives of the people he loves. There is something more important than the judgment of the church.
Silence, 2016. Martin Scorsese's film follows two 17th-century Portuguese Jesuit priests, Rodrigues and Garupe, who travel to Japan to find their mentor, rumored to have renounced his faith under persecution. They arrive into a brutal campaign against Christianity, where peasant converts are tortured and drowned for refusing to trample on an image of Christ. Rodrigues prays constantly for guidance, and the prayers fall into a silence that gives nothing back, no comfort, no sign, no answer of any kind. Simone Weil distinguished ordinary suffering from what she called malheur, affliction that doesn't just hurt the body, but invades and degrades the soul, making the sufferer feel abandoned by God at the exact moment they need God most. She wrote that this abandonment functions as the precise mechanism through which God's absence becomes detectable at all. A God who constantly intervened would never be absent enough to be missed. Rodrigues experiences this almost clinically. He watches Japanese peasants die for a faith he preached to them, while he himself is offered an exit: trample the image, save their lives, end the killing. Weil's attente de Dieu, waiting on God without demanding response, never promises that waiting will be answered in time to prevent harm. It only insists that the waiting itself, the refusal to manufacture comfort, is the only honest posture left. When Rodrigues finally steps on the image, the film stages the act with the same theological seriousness it gave the martyrdoms that preceded it, an apostasy chosen specifically to stop another person's suffering, the self deliberately diminished so someone else doesn't have to be.
Christian, pendant toute ma vie de médecin, j'ai eu affaire à toutes sortes de gens très différents, y compris les nazis, et même le diable. J'ai pas peur, moi, des terroristes et encore moins de l'armée. Je crains pas la mort non plus, je suis un homme libre.
Of Gods and Men, 2010. Xavier Beauvois's film follows a community of French Trappist monks living in a monastery in the Atlas Mountains of Algeria during the 1990s Civil War. As Islamist violence spreads through the region and foreign workers are murdered nearby, the monks face a choice the film refuses to rush: leave while they still can, or stay with the Muslim villagers who depend on their medical clinic and their presence. Viktor Frankl spent 3 years in concentration camps and emerged with a claim that sounds modest until you sit with it. Everything can be taken from a person except one thing: the freedom to choose an attitude in any given circumstance. He didn't mean this as comfort. He meant it as a description of where freedom actually lives once every external freedom has been stripped away. In the last inch of the will, the part that decides how to face what can't be changed. The monks' debate, staged across multiple dinner table scenes, is Frankl's claim under pressure. Christian, the prior, argues that leaving would empty the choice of meaning before they ever finish making it, that the decision has to be lived inside the danger, not made safely from outside it. Brother Luke, the elderly doctor, keeps treating patients with the same unhurried attention whether or not the gunmen come tomorrow, as if the contents of the day shouldn't change just because the day might be the last one. None of them know if staying will save anyone. Frankl never promised that meaning prevents harm, only that the choice to find it remains even when nothing else does. The monks vote, one by one, to stay, each casting it as a private decision rather than a collective gesture. That privacy is the detail Frankl would have pointed to. Freedom exercised at the level of one person facing one choice, never as a crowd.
言葉はまやかしである。だが行動に嘘はない。芸術と行動を一体化することは可能なことなのであろうか。文武両道、散らぬ花と散る花を兼ね備えることは一体実現可能なことであろうか。
Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, 1985. Paul Schrader's film moves between 3 registers: black and white scenes from Yukio Mishima's actual childhood and rise as a writer, vivid color sequences dramatizing 3 of his novels, and the final day of his life in 1970, when he and a small private militia stormed a military base, took a general hostage, delivered a speech demanding a coup, and then committed ritual suicide. Nietzsche's amor fati, the love of fate, gets quoted often and understood rarely. It isn't resignation dressed up in nicer language. Nietzsche meant something closer to an artistic standard. A life is justified the way a piece of art is justified, by the formal necessity of its parts, not by whether those parts were pleasant. He wanted his readers to want their suffering exactly as it occurred, with no detail subtracted, because subtracting the suffering would also subtract the shape. The film stages Mishima's life as a man building toward that kind of formal necessity. As a sickly, overprotected child barred from sunlight and rough play, he discovered that he could remake his weakness into material. First through writing, later through obsessive bodybuilding, finally through a public death staged with the same compositional control he brought to his novels. Schrader cuts directly from the fictional climaxes of Mishima's books to his real final hours, treating the suicide as the last completed sentence of that same body of work. Nietzsche warned that most people who claim to love their fate are only tolerating it. Mishima's death was an argument that he met the stricter version of the bar, a life composed with enough formal control that he could stand behind even its ending.
You've been a great disappointment, John.
No, Mr. Merrick, no. No son as loving as you could ever be a disappointment.
The Elephant Man, 1980. David Lynch's film, shot in stark black and white, follows Joseph Merrick, called John in the film, a severely disfigured man exhibited as a sideshow attraction in Victorian London. Dr. Frederick Trevis discovers him in a freak show, brings him to the London hospital, and gradually a hospital staff that first approached Merrick as a medical curiosity has to reckon with him as a person who reads, writes letters, and quotes scripture back at them with more precision than they expected. Levinas built his philosophy around something he called the face. He meant the demand a person makes on you simply by being present in front of you, a claim that arrives before any reasoning, before any decision about whether they deserve your concern. The face resists being reduced to a category. It interrupts. For Levinas, ethics doesn't start with a rule you apply to a person. It starts with a person standing there, making a claim that arrived before the rule did. Merrick's face is the literal test case Levinas's theory was never given. Every character who looks at him has the option to see only the deformity, a thing to gawk at, profit from, or clinically document. Bites, the showman, sees a commodity. The hospital porter who charges nightly admission to gawk at Merrick sees the same thing under a different uniform. Trevis starts the film occupying that position too, studying Merrick's skull for a medical paper, before he registers Merrick as someone capable of answering back. The shift happens in small moments, Merrick reciting the 23rd Psalm to prove he isn't the mute object Trevis assumed, Merrick building a paper model of a cathedral he'll never enter, Merrick simply asking to be looked at as a man and not a curiosity. None of this fixes his condition or extends his life. What it does, in Levinas's terms, is force the people around him to answer to him rather than about him. 7 philosophers, 7 films, not one shared answer. Kierkegaard asks for a leap. Camus refuses it. Dostoevsky calls it a debt. Weil finds God in his absence. Nietzsche asks you to want it all again. None of them agree what suffering means. Maybe that's the only honest place to leave it. Thank you for watching.